Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. Well, welcome back, everyone. We are here for another episode, and we are talking about another important issue. We're talking about relationships today.
Yay! This is a topic I've wanted to do for a long time. And we've kind of brought this up before in our prior sessions with Jamie. I mean, it's something that we've talked obliquely about, but we wanted to really dedicate some time. So
yeah, it's something that gets put on the back burner a lot when you're going through fertility treatment, and it can be really hard because, you know, we have to try to exist outside of something that is kind of taking over a lot of space in your life. So this is going to be a really interesting topic. So I'm going to introduce our guest today. Suzi Mohn is an individual couples and family therapist in Issaquah, Washington, providing therapies to, just like what I said, individuals, couples, and families. She specializes in working with individuals and couples in crisis, especially those with infertility, infidelity, relationship issues, pregnancy loss, high-risk pregnancies, just all the things, all the important things. She provides clinical supervision to other therapists who are working towards licensure. We're really excited to have her on today.
Yeah, and I have known Suzi forever because she was the leader of my infertility support group, which I've mentioned in prior episodes was probably like the best thing I ever did for myself when I was in treatment. So I was really excited to be able to connect after a long time. And I mean, I just can't think of the fact that it's been all these years. That means there's all these other people that you have helped the way you helped me. So I'm glad you're still out there doing all this really important work. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's been a long time since we started working together. I think around 2008 or something.
Yeah,
that's a really cool full circle, though.
Yeah, yeah.
And we've done so many episodes where we talked about how stressful infertility is in all different areas of the life. And so for this one, we really want to focus on people that are in a relationship, because there's certainly lots of challenges when people are going through this by themselves. And there's so many challenges unique to being a single parent. But for people that are trying to be a couple with somebody, most of the time you're not on you're different people. So you're not on the exact same page with how you're going to process this big life stress. And that can lead to conflict. And that's what we want to pick your brain about today.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. It is absolutely a source of huge conflict on top of the other things they're already dealing with. So
it's funny because right now my brain is kind of like shutting down, like what should I start with? Because it is such like a big topic and like hard to address kind of topic when you're going through it too. So I think that's a really good representation of like why it's important to talk to somebody when you're going through all this, because if my brain can do that just because I'm about ready to talk about it,
right,
that tells me that it's important, right?
And like we do for a lot of our guests, I mean, let's start by just asking like how you got into this specialty area. What kind of led you to focus in couples in crisis, and especially infertility, infidelity, all those things we just mentioned?
So my oldest daughter she's going to kill me if I get this wrong, almost 36. And when she was 2 or so, my former husband and I started trying to have another baby, and that resulted in ultimately 6 years of infertility treatments and 6 different IVF cycles, an enormous amount of trauma and stress, and the story goes on from there. But the short version is at some point down the process, I really, after having done a lot of different support groups as a client or as a person going through it, just realized when I was sort of on the other side of it, or at least I thought I was on the other side of it, I wanted to, help other couples who were going through it. And I didn't want them to experience some of the things that we had in our relationship and the trauma of just going through infertility. And it was part of a really big life change I had. And so I went back to graduate school and became a therapist, and that became infertility and supporting couples going through it became a big part of my practice. So,
what did you think you were going to do? What was your kind of life plan after your first daughter? Like, what did you imagine yourself doing for the rest of your career?
At that point, I had a public relations business, and I'd had it for about 15 years, working with nonprofits and municipalities, doing newsletters and graphic design and doing a lot of public speaking and things like that. And so I think I assumed that I would continue that career. But, sometimes life throws new things at you and you do a huge shift.
Let's go down that left road right now instead.
I know. I think I'm always fascinated because, there's so many people that work in this field that had that sort of event. And like every now and then I think about alternate me and like, would I just be a midwife? What would my life be like? And it's like when you end up specializing in something, it's almost hard to imagine the person that you thought you were going to be at this stage.
And you would have an alternate you out of all, you have an alternate you somewhere, definitely in the Marvel universe somewhere, there's an alternate Anne.
I remember when we first met, Anne, I think you were in the infertility support group, you were an OBGYN nurse, right?
Yeah, I was a labor and delivery nurse. Like my life was all very much on my path to work in the birth field forever, and that's
so OBGYN nurse too. It's like I have everything right where I need it to be.
I am ready, and then
I am prepared.
Life sends you somewhere different, and then you can't imagine what you thought you'd be doing.
Well, and I just remember in the support group thinking, oh my God, what a hard job for someone to be doing who's going through infertility, right? So I think this is kind of what happens to all of us, right? As life happens and all of a sudden it's like, oh, reset, version two.
Everybody's situation is different, but you've done this for so long. Like, are there common themes that you often see that come up in relationships? Like, what do you feel like are the most important things to tell our listeners about the struggles that could come along with this?
Certainly some of the dynamics shift between male, female gender couples and LGBTQ couples. So some of the issues, of course, shift because of that. But overall, couples are couples, right? And so they struggle based on their ways of coping and the way they sort of conceptualize the experience, the way they understand it, right? And what it means to them. And, there's all kinds of past issues in their lives typically that tie into how they experience it. And so everybody comes into it with their own unique set of circumstances and their own unique set of life experiences. And they bring all that to the party for starters. And then infertility often happens when couples are younger because for obvious reasons, we try to have kids before we're, 60. And so a lot of times those couples haven't experienced massive amounts of trauma as a couple or even as individuals necessarily. And sometimes infertility becomes like the first sort of major crisis they've ever experienced. And they probably haven't been married that long, often less than 5 years. And so, they're also dealing with the newness of trying to navigate a relationship. And then all of a sudden they get this huge health issue thrown at them and suddenly they have to navigate that.
That's such a good point. I never really thought about the age part before, but it's true because I do feel like I see a difference in some of our patients when they're starting their family in their 40s and they might have already dealt with a job loss or a parent's death or they
previous relationship, whatever.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Versus if this is really the first major challenge where things haven't gone to plan for you, I do think that is sort of rocks you to your sense of self a little bit more because
right to the core.
It's just not something that you expect either. This is something that many people, your whole education has been trying to avoid pregnancy. And there's just this assumption that when you're ready, it's just going to happen. So
absolutely.
In the beginning of that relationship, there's so much planning and dreaming of what your lives are going to be like together and all of that. And sometimes it can put a big roadblock in all the plans that you were thinking were going to happen.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting because a lot of times couples come in and one of the first things they say is, I've done everything right. I've gone to school. I've worked really hard. Mm-hmm. I've been, I've done things the way I thought I was supposed to do them. And this isn't working. And that alone is sort of earth shaking for people because there is sort of this thought that if I do everything right, it's going to work out. And it doesn't always.
Especially that waiting piece. Like if people have deliberately waited to start trying until they were more stable in their career, until they got more financial, then you feel like you're being punished for waiting until you're a little bit older. And everyone's like, maybe I should have just been in high school and had unprotected intercourse. And I think a lot of people suddenly look back on their past years of contraception as being like a waste, not realizing all the downsides to had you had a child before you were in this more stable place.
Right. And that happens more and more now, I think, because they're getting married later. They are going on to school. They are doing things. And it's harder and harder to know that you're going to have the expenses of raising a child and to plan in advance. And so people make this what seems like a super responsible decision and what is a responsible decision. Mm-hmm. And then when it backfires, it just feels like insult to injury. It's like, what? It's
so
not
much.
Fair. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the most heartbreaking things that people say to me is, but I did everything right. And I'm like, you did. You did.
You did.
You know, it's like, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't even know when or if this is a real stat, but years ago, some article was talking about how when you do have male-female couples like that, in general, many men like lag behind the female in terms of perception of this being a problem, like often by 1 to 3 years. And so when you're looking at like how people are experiencing the stress of the process, that's often one of the frustrating points, is that one person is very worried and the other person is like, well, it's only been a year, it's only been 6 months. And that sets off the dynamic to already be in conflict, even when you maybe don't meet the definition of infertility yet.
I think before you've even evaluated infertility, that can set off conflict.
Yeah, there are people that if it doesn't happen the first month, instantly decide that something's wrong. So sometimes we are trying to have to dial down a little bit the worries.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it is, I think that is really hard. And I think, when they think they're doing this very responsible thing and trying to make appropriate choices and then it backfires, it's really rough. And then that creates its own separate conflict.
What do you do when people are on kind of different timelines? Like when one person is like, we got to go to the doctor, I want to do a full workup. And the other person's like, I think we're panicking. Let's give it another 3 months, 6 months. Like, how do you kind of talk about something like that?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways it starts with some sort of psychoeducation, right? Because I think a lot of people don't actually know that much about how quickly the biological clock is ticking, right? I don't think they often realize that, gosh, your 20s, your late 20s, early to late 20s, and maybe into, and you guys are more experts at this than I am, but, as you get into your 30s, things start to get more complicated. And certainly as you approach 40, much more complicated. So I think there's a piece of it where we just start talking about kind of, well, what are the statistics on it? What does it look like? And also just trying to get a sense of where they are in terms of, from two perspectives, medically, have they talked to an OBGYN? Have they done any actual medical, gotten any medical knowledge about where they are? But being a couples therapist, I think most of my work is really at that point trying to understand where each of them are coming from and what their priorities are, what their concerns are, what their fears are, and kind of first hearing from each one of them about that and then starting to address it as a couple.
It's fascinating, that question about medical workup, because I do feel like just over the last decade, I get a lot more patients that are being referred for testing if they are, for example, a single female and they're in their mid-30s. I think like we've gotten pretty good at asking about eventual family plans for women. I don't know a single guy that's ever been asked in his physical, like, so if you haven't thought about your family, that's true. They don't even necessarily go. But yeah, like I think we do have a talk a little on one side, although more to go. But you're right. I there's so much cultural pressure where I feel like people do often ask women what their ideals are, and we don't talk a lot about like, the importance to fatherhood of a lot of people, and maybe this is something that they have thought a lot about. And so I don't want to stereotype to say that they're always like hands off and not worried. Sometimes it is the other side. I've had men do a single visit and like they want to talk about their fertility and they want to kind of understand what's going on. So there's certainly still, everyone is in a different place.
Absolutely. And admittedly, I think men can be older and still father children, right? So there's that piece of it. They may not feel the same level of pressure, but it's interesting. I often can tell, even when the first call or email comes in from a couple, if it's coming from the woman or coming from the man, I can kind of tell, okay, well, this is who's most worried about it.
I can usually tell when the female partners filled out the intake paperwork for the male partner as well.
Me too. I'm like, you guys have the exact same everything for alcohol and lifestyle and exercise. Right. I was like, really?
I know.
One of my favorite questions though is to compare, like looking at when they tell you like how many times they have intercourse. Yeah. And it's like, it's always like there's a discrepancy. I'm like, well, you guys are both there at the same time. So it's like,
they better be.
It's so funny. Right. Yeah, it's a whole nother.
that's another area of expertise.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. And that happens. That happens with alcohol consumption and a variety of other things. I've just sort of learned to multiply by 5. So.
And when people come to see you, are they often coming as a couple, or are you usually seeing one person and then often you're trying to like encourage them to consider bringing their partner in for that conversation too?
Probably all of the above. I mean, I typically, when I get approached by an individual, often the female, almost always the female, I usually first start out by saying, is this something you might want to think about doing as a couple, right? Because it's just, couples therapy and just therapy in general is so systemic that you really have to look at the whole family system and the couple system and all of that. And you can help so much more if you're addressing it systemically. So I always start out by saying, is this something you'd like to consider? And sometimes they want to, and sometimes they say, I just really need my own person right now. And so typically with counseling, if you work with somebody individually for, several sessions, it's a little tougher to transition to couples work. But if it's primarily around infertility, there have been situations where I've worked with a woman who've done a few sessions and then she's like, actually, I think I really want my partner here, and then we can transition.
I was just going to ask if that is like, if you've had several therapy visits with somebody and then they want to bring their partner in, like, is it hard to then look at things systemically when you've been just talking to one person, one side of the story?
Yeah. So, I mean, I obviously have to be very careful when you do that. And you can't have work with someone for 6 months and then be like, okay, now we're going to add, and if you can maybe bring them in as a guest, as a support to the individual therapy process. Mm-hmm. And that's possible. But if you've just done a few sessions and there's recognition that I really want my partner in here, then I think you come in, and I'm always very transparent and say, hey, I've been working with your partner here for, the last 5 sessions. And so we're probably a little out of balance. So I might offer to do some individual sessions with the partner, but we try to make it really transparent. And I try to say, if you're ever feeling like I'm not getting you or supporting your partner more, then let's be really transparent and have that conversation so that we get on the same page.
You're like, remember that fight you had 5 months ago with your partner? Now I want your side of the story.
Right. Yeah. That's always a can of worms. Yeah, exactly.
You're like, wait, what did you tell her?
Yeah. Well, part of the reason we wanted to talk to you is I feel like it's a very common situation where people do put the quality of the relationship on the back burner, you get so focused on the fertility goal and that you do let other issues fester. Maybe someone doesn't remember that fight 5 months ago because you were really mad about it, but you didn't want to get into an argument about it because you were ovulating and you were like, oh no, intercourse is more important right now. It's so important to still think about the fact that you're a couple and you want to be a couple that parents together too in the future. So it's crucial. And I think it's very hard to keep that priority because often people feel like they only have so much mental energy and all their mental energy is going towards the fertility goals right now. And they feel like I'll fix the relationship issues later.
I think that you have identified probably one of the biggest and most key issues that come up in couples therapy when we're dealing with infertility stuff. I just think there's that idea of thinking this is so all consuming that I can only do this and everything else needs to, be on the sidelines because I can't possibly cope with all of it together is a super common phenomenon. I always try to remind couples, you're not just parents in waiting, you're a couple and you want to actually still be married when the baby gets here, right? You don't want to go through all this and then have it all fall apart. That's a huge piece. That's a huge piece of this.
And in some ways, I think it's such a natural phenomenon, but when you work on improving the relationship, that actually can make the fertility stuff easier because suddenly you feel like you got that extra support, or maybe it doesn't seem quite as stressful because you're not also in the back of your mind stressed about the fact that you haven't clearly been communicating and that kind of stuff too. So I think, it's a really important thing to prioritize, but it's very hard to do sometimes.
It is. It's interesting. Sometimes, like lots of crises, sometimes infertility can bring couples together because it gives them a topic that is not necessarily a conflict between them, but sort of this external challenge that they're facing together as a couple. And I think when couples come into it, and this happens a lot in the early parts of therapy, just, sort of getting the recognition that this is a couple's problem. It doesn't matter if it's female infertility or male infertility or unexplained infertility or some combination. It's a couple's problem at the end of the day. If they can look at it that way and sort of attack it together, then it's sort of the two of them against it. It can actually, if it's done right, can actually really help strengthen relationships.
That's going to be my next question. If you see a difference in those dynamics based on diagnosis, because sometimes I'll see that in the clinic. If it's, very clearly that it's the low sperm count is the prime issue, or, I do feel like there's some people that take it exactly the way you should, because it really is a couples issue. And often there is some sort of contribution on both sides. But I have seen some dynamics where I'm uncomfortable. Like I'll have, be in the room and the female patient will be like, well, I'm only here because of him. And I can't believe I'm having to have this ultrasound. I mean, it's just these things where I was like, wow, this is the same thing. Like, I hope this dynamic improves, like, for parenting.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure there's moments in it where you're like, are you sure you want to do this together? You want to keep on going?
Yeah.
But I mean, I think a lot of it also comes down to kind of how people perceive themselves. Again, this is going to sound just somewhat gender limiting, but as a woman or a man, how they perceive themselves. There are certainly, or however they perceive themselves gender wise, right? So sometimes, there are situations where men feel like it's like a personal affront to their masculinity, right? If they have a low sperm count or they have bad morphology or bad motility or whatever. Or women feel like I'm a failure if I can't have a child or if I can't give my husband a child, So there's certainly religious preconceptions and familial expectations and all kinds of things
cultural.
that play in cultural that play into kind of how I perceive myself as in terms of my ability to parent or not. And that can be a really serious source of conflict right from the get-go.
And anger is so normal. It's such a normal response, It's just interesting as providers when the blame anger, and we're sitting there and we're like, oh, this is a lot. You have some big feelings right now, kind of thing. And they're legitimate. And I don't think everyone always thinks like I need a relationship or a couples therapist right now. But it's actually probably a good idea to start it sooner than you would originally think. You're like, well, we're fine now. If it gets really bad, then I will, Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a huge kind of argument for considering talking to someone early in the process, right? And the stuff also sneaks up on you. A lot of people haven't necessarily thought about their perceptions about a lot of these topics until they're faced with them. And then it's like, oh, all of a sudden I realize this is actually really upsetting to me.
You brought up, how we're using a lot of gender terms, but, when people are in LGBT relationships, like there are certainly unique challenges there as well. Maybe talk a little bit about in your practice, like how that changes the dynamic if you're having to decide whose eggs are we using or whose sperm are we using? How do you kind of have those conversations when you're dealing with couples?
Even prior to that, there's just this sense of LGBTQ couples have had to go through the whole process before even fertility is on the table of acknowledging their sexuality and coming out and facing all the challenges of what that experience was like all by itself. And then they're faced with like this next major kind of life experience or life transition or rite of passage or whatever, which is having children. It's like yet another challenge that LGBT couples have to face to feel like they're on equal footing with heterosexual couples. So it already feels sort of unfair and unjust to even start with, right? And then they have tough choices to make. If it's two women, for example, then they've got to decide, okay, well, whose eggs are we going to use? Or who's going to carry the baby? Is one of us going to carry the baby and the other one donate their eggs? And if that's the case and we want to do it that way, then that's way much more work because you have to actually go through the whole process of egg retrieval and all of that to transfer them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we have all these options, but I do feel like it's probably a little overwhelming compared to the way it used to be when it was like, well, we just need sperm. We'll start off with that. And you were just kind of deciding who would try. Now you have almost like decision fatigue because it can feel like you have all these high-tech options. Shouldn't you use them? And, so sometimes talking about what really is important to each person is so crucial and not just getting sucked into the bells and whistles of what fertility treatment could potentially do.
Right. Absolutely. So, So, I mean, so you go through all those conversations before you even get to square one. If it's, if it's two men, then it's whose sperm are we going to use? And are we going to hire a surrogate? Or do we know somebody who's willing to carry the baby and whose eggs are we going to use? And so, I mean, it adds another level of complexity. It's already so hard, even when you have a heterosexual couple to go through all this. But unless there's an egg quality issue or a sperm quality issue, they typically know if they're using their own eggs and own sperm, they typically know, okay, well, that's already decided, and for LGBTQ couples, they have to, sort all that out on top of everything else.
Well, when we talked with Jamie Kelton from the Queer Families podcast last year, we had a really good conversation about the intentionality when it comes to LGBTQIA couples, because they do have a lot of decisions to make up front before they even decide, like, do they even want to go to a fertility clinic in some cases? Right. Do they want to do things at home? Like, there's so many little decisions. So I could see where decision fatigue can kind of play in, especially if maybe one or both partners have different ideas for how they want to proceed.
I mean, and I think that's one of the challenges with both LGBTQIA couples as well as heterosexual couples, or any couple, honestly, is just, are we on the same page? What are we going to do if we're not on the same page? How do we navigate that? Because then that almost becomes, then you have the infertility as an issue, and you have the fact that we're not in agreement on how to proceed forward as another issue.
How do you help people? Like, when people are stuck and they're just not on the same page, like, how do you unstick somebody?
Well, I have a magic wand in my desk drawer.
Yeah, exactly. You have like the easy button from Staples where you're just like, boop, here's what you do next.
Right.
Well, we're really good at fixing things in 5 minutes too, Anne. Maybe we should all start a practice together.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just a magic button. No, I mean, I think then it's sort of I guess, for lack of better explanation, just sort of a typical therapy process of like trying to kind of understand each person and where they're coming from and what their priorities are and why they're feeling the way they're feeling. And then at some point trying to transition from their own individual perceptions and desires and choices and et cetera to like, okay, well, how do we then navigate this as a couple? Because, remember, you're married, so it's really easy for each partner to kind of identify, I shouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier for couples to identify kind of where they stand, how they feel, what their intentions and hopes and dreams are. And then there's sort of that piece of, okay, but you're not single. You're in a marriage relationship or a couple relationship. And so now how do we do this in a way that's going to at least buy each of you some amount of comfort, satisfaction, acceptance, whatever. So it's partly navigating that. And sometimes just in that conversation, stuff comes out that we realize in the process that maybe they're not as far apart as they thought they were, but they just needed to be able to say and put out everything they were feeling. So it can go a lot of ways.
And don't worry, we're going to fix everything in the snack. Our snack is going to be kind of like how partners can be supported. Like, we have this great handout that you made that's emergency advice for partners. Yeah. When you can't fix the problem and nothing you say or do seems to help, you've got this whole tips. So we're going to talk about that on the snack. So
I'm going to print that and give that to Dion. So
I love it. That, that's so funny. That came out of, I was doing a couple support group back in Portland. I mean, I think I was in grad school. I can't even remember. This has been a long time ago, but we were doing a couple support group, and we had done a breakout group with men and a breakout group with women. And I was like, okay, let's just talk about for each, separate genders, so what's going on for you guys, and it was so interesting because I thought, I'm going to get all these guys together and they're just going to really want to talk about the game, or whatever sport is going on. And boy, they did not. They were a distraught bunch of guys. They were just like, oh my God, I can't deal with, whether it's my wife's hormones or her crying or the sadness or the helplessness of not knowing what to do or any of that. And so we kind of proceeded forward to come up with this list, and the women kind of added what they really thought would help, and the men talked about it. And the list came out of an actual organic process. It was pretty fun.
Well, I love it. It's a great list. So we are not going to talk about it now, but we're going to talk about it in our next episode. So
totally fine.
Listeners, don't worry. Everything's going to get fixed next week.
All fixed. Yes, all fixed.
Well, one question I had about couples, if they both have eggs and uteruses, is let's say we have a plan. The plan has always been that partner A is wanting to be the egg source or carry the pregnancy, XYZ. But that doesn't work out because we actually run up against a fertility issue. Like maybe we have decreased egg supply or something. It's just not happening with that partner. And we bring this up a lot in the fertility clinic about what if we pivoted and look at the other partner? And that can be a source of contention as well, especially if the other partner happens to get pregnant really quickly. What is that pregnancy going to be like when the other person's gone through an infertility journey, basically?
I mean, that's a great question. And, I think there's no question there's a grief process in this, right? There's a grief process in anybody who goes through the experience of not being able to conceive, or recognizing that for whatever reason, whether they've waited too long or their egg quality isn't good, or maybe their egg quality is fine, but they can't, for whatever reason, sustain a pregnancy, whatever it is, right? There's a grief process. And it can be exacerbated by the fact that, oh, but my partner over here can do it just fine. That's not fair. It's interesting because when you look at couples going through, or people going through infertility, there's a lot of time spent in therapy actually around the idea of how do I even interact with people when they're getting pregnant? How do I interact with, my cousin who's having a baby shower, or my sister who's just having her third child and I'm still trying to have my first? And there's a huge amount of this kind of really uncomfortable experience of, I'm supposed to be happy for them and thrilled for them and be positive. And yet at the same time, inside, I'm just dying. I'm hurting so much. And I wish this could be me, but I can't really say that because then I just sound terrible, And so there's this inner battle. And some of that, same stuff plays out in the scenario you're describing, right? Is that somehow I'm with this person. I love them. I'm in a relationship with them, and they're getting something that I want so badly. And I can't do that. And so then there's that whole dynamic that comes out of that, of how is that going to affect our parenting and our feelings around parenting this child together when it feels imbalanced before we even start.
I'm going to date myself in our support group, but I remember in our group how many of us had complicated feelings about Angelina Jolie, because our group had people that were also trying to adopt. And so we're like, oh, great. Not only did she just have this baby, and she just adopted another child. And other people are like, I've been on an adoption wait list for like a year. How is Angelina Jolie able to just keep adopting? So,
oh boy, I remember.
But to be able to sit there in another room of people who all had that same like instant, like, oh, did you see it? I can't believe another. And you realize like, oh yeah, everyone else is feeling like this. Like, I'm not a bad, terrible person for seeing this and not thinking, oh, what a wonderful person, for my first thought being like, really? Another baby?
Right.
So.
Right. Oh, I remember that. I do remember that. And that was, and it's so true, right? Because how many safe spaces are there where you can actually express your frustration, your anger, how unfair it is, all that kind of stuff, without, being worried that somebody's going to really judge you and go, what is their problem? Why can't they manage this? And
that's why group therapy or group support groups are so important, because when you're going through infertility, it's so isolating and there's not a lot of safe space to talk about it. Like I have had some people that are like, oh, my boss is very supportive, or I do have this group of friends, like, which is great. Like, that's always awesome when you have your people, but more often than not, there's like your spouse or your partner.
And often people that are normally your people are now a source of strain, because now they're having their kids and they're not saying helpful things to you. And so then you feel even worse, because the people that would support you through other life challenges are now like not really great at this one. Yeah,
your usual safe spaces are no longer safe. And that's really hard.
It's interesting because, when I think about the women I've worked with, sometimes the people that support you come out of the blue, right? The people you don't expect, and the people that you're really hoping will support you aren't able to show up or don't show up for whatever reason. And everybody comes into fertility issues with such preconceived ideas and values and thoughts around what it is to be a parent and when you should have kids and parenting and all of that, that it's hard to even know what they're bringing to the table. But the judgment can be really painful and the isolation can be painful. There's a great book, I think it's a million years old now, but it's called Infertility Sucks. And it's just, as I recall, it's just filled with like responses to stupid things people say. So like when they say this to you, you can respond like this, because people sometimes really don't get it. And that just, again, adds insult to injury to the process.
And then you also have the emotional burden of having to explain, like if you are in a position where you feel like you have to explain, like, no, like whatever silly thing that they said, and this is why, that's also an emotional burden. I'm like, I'm not responsible for teaching you why this was not a thing, something that you should have asked me.
Right. Right. Exactly. I have a big long book list of books that I've sort of like, maybe you should ask your mom to read this book or your sister to read this book. Or
accidentally leave them.
Yeah, any resources that you have that you want us to, pass on for listeners, because I think, you're such a wealth of knowledge. And I want to put a plug in again for the support groups, because I feel like nowadays everything really has pivoted to, social media feeds and message boards. And I'm not saying that it can't be a good source of support, but I think there is something about having a real, genuine connection with a real person where you do see each other face to face. Even if it's face to face through a screen, at least you are seeing that they're really a person and not just like a bot trying to get you to subscribe to their sell you ovulation kits and stuff. But
subscribe to our podcast.
Yes, but our podcast is fine. But for me, that was one of the most helpful things about the group, was to look around this room and be like, oh my gosh, these are amazing women. Like, look at everybody who is smart and normal, and like, it's not anything weird or wrong about the fact that we're going through infertility. And that really helped make me feel so much less alone in the process. And I wish everybody could just get assigned their like group meeting when they enter the clinic, because I think it's really, for me, again, was kind of life-changing in terms of normalizing the experience and making me realize that was just, this is something I'm just gonna have to go through, and look at all these other nice, normal people that are also going through something similar.
Well, and it was, it's interesting, the idea that we met in person and that we met every week, and the fact that it's been now, I don't know how many years, but not quite 20.
15, 16 at least, yeah.
Right, like and that. We're all still friends.
Actually, 17, yeah.
We all still are friends, and when people have babies, we talk about, whatever they go through, we're still connected. So that was incredible. I think one of the values of support groups too, especially, I guess it could be in person or online, is that when you're facilitating something like that, the first thing you do is you sort of figure out, like, where is each person in this process? And are they able to safely contribute in a way that will blend with the group, right? And won't cause some additional trauma? Do they maybe need more individual therapy before they can do a group or whatever? And so that piece is an important part of the process, I think, because sometimes when you're in online groups and it's just online reading and commenting, you've got people who are in all ranges of this process and can really spiral down some deep, dark tunnels. And if you're already insecure about your process that you're going through, or insecure about, what your diagnosis is, all it takes is reading about somebody's diagnosis that's similar to yours or whatever that's really gone badly to just spiral down into a really dark place.
That was my other thing. I worry now that people are so siloed into trying to like find the thing that's the people that are exactly like them. And I got so much benefit from the fact that our group was a range of experiences, like being able to see people who have been working towards adoption and the ups and downs of that, maybe really realize, oh, there's so many different ways to approach parenting. And like, that was probably the best thing I got out of the group. I didn't need to compare IVF treatment protocols. I can research myself online to go down that, but to just get to hear, all the challenges and different types really was the other thing that made it so normalizing for me to be like, okay, there are so many ways to be a parent. There are challenges with all ways to become a parent. There are challenges when people get pregnant easily and then health things come up. So no one has the easy path, and seeing that we can still get through it and still talk about our experiences was really, really beneficial. So I would encourage people to not be searching for the people that are most like their experience, but just, be open to talking with a whole range of people.
I think it's interesting when I think back on that group and all the other groups I've led, no matter.
We're the best one. You can say we're the best one.
Oh my God, you guys were amazing. And actually the truth is I keep in touch with you more than any. I mean, so yes, there's a reason why we're still talking. But, it's interesting at the end of the day in each group, what people really could say consistently was, I just want to be a mom. I just want to be a parent. That's what I want. And that was universal across the group. So no matter how they got there, no matter what they were going through to get there, that was something we all really shared in common. And it was an interesting process for me, honestly, too, because I had, mine was years behind me by the time we were in that group. But I found all kinds of healing, even for myself, in reflecting on everybody's experiences. And that was just this added bonus, of doing it for me. That was just a real gift.
So how can people try and find a support group?
Well, I wish that was as easy as I want. It's never easy. But, when Resolve was a national group and then had state groups, and we could all work through our state Resolve chapter, that made this process much easier. And so I'm a little out of the loop on how Resolve is doing it now. I think you can, go to their national website and you can still look and you can find some support group leaders through that. So there are some groups, but they're mostly peer-led support groups. Now, I think my hope is when I get my youngest launched off to college that I can again go back and just, do the support groups. And I think at that point, there's other ways for therapists to market that kind of stuff online in ways that the community can access it. So, whether it's through talking to your reproductive endocrinologist, office and making sure that there's a connection made there. But I think it's even valuable to connect with OBGYNs, because lots of times people, they haven't gotten to a reproductive endocrinologist yet, and they could actually really use a support group even before that, right? Because there's several stages of infertility that people go through, and treatment is actually, when I think about the stages, and we can talk about that, but treatment's actually a little ways in, right? So sometimes people don't even get to seeking support until they're already deep into treatment, and by then they've already had quite a bit of struggle.
That's the hard part. I mean, we've certainly mentioned Resolve in numerous podcasts, and that's where I direct people to start too. I think in our area, they do now just kind of a monthly drop-in, which is it's nice. I mean, it's certainly better than nothing, but I do feel like there's a value from something that's a little bit more structured in terms of that consistency of the people, and I wish there was an easier way to have that. Yeah.
I think they had a Monday night drop-in at Evergreen for a while. I'm not even sure what all they're doing right now. I think having a small group of 7 to 9 people to talk about it feels a lot more intimate and consistent.
I wish this was a visual podcast, because I kind of want to just end it with a picture of Chris Traeger from Parks and Rec just being like, therapy. 2 thumbs up.
I love it.
Well, it is funny to me, we brought this up multiple times before, how I feel like maybe it's because there is kind of that stigma and people don't want to think that they would need therapy. But, the people that will spend hundreds of dollars on supplements that we don't have any evidence will help, but don't want to spend, a couple $100 to see a therapist and talk about. And this is so much more value added, especially if you're feeling these strains in your relationships, which almost everybody who's partnered and going through this feels, to be able to have kind of a neutral, reserved third party that has experience in these conversations to let the two of you really talk. I mean, I think that is, I can say 100% going to be far more valuable than many of the other things that the influencers online are trying to sell you.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine also, and you could certainly speak to this more than I can, but I remember even talking to my reproductive endocrinologist back at Oregon Health Sciences University years ago. And for her, I mean, it was like she had her hands full trying to do egg retrievals and egg donation, working with couples, and to deal with the emotional aspects. It's not that she didn't want to and didn't care about it. It was just that there wasn't space when you're going patient after patient after patient doing infertility stuff. So being able to collaborate as a team of professionals to help people and in a wraparound way makes a huge difference.
Perfect. Well, tune in next week when we
fix everything.
And give you the list that you can send to your partner to say, here is what I want you to do. So, yes. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us, Suzi.
Oh, you're welcome. It was an absolute pleasure. It was so good to see you guys.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.